The restaurant shimmered beneath soft amber lights that hung like warm stars from the ceiling, reflecting gently off the polished marble floors. Each table was set with precision, crystal glasses glinting, silver utensils gleaming, and tall candles flickering against the delicate porcelain plates. The air was thick with the aroma of truffle pasta, rosemary, and aged red wine, blending with the low hum of conversation and the quiet notes of a live violinist playing near the entrance. It was the kind of place where power dined in silence, where fortunes were exchanged over fine meals and subtle gestures. At a secluded table near the wide glass window sat Edward Thorne, a man whose name carried weight in every financial circle across Europe. His wealth wasn't inherited. It was built, carved out of decades of ruthless business decisions and sharp instincts that had earned him both admiration and fear. Tonight, however, he wasn't here for business in the usual sense. He was here for beauty, for art, for something money alone couldn't buy: authenticity. Across from him sat an Italian art dealer named Marco Bellini, a man with slick-back hair, polished shoes, and a charm that could sell ice in the Arctic. His reputation in the art world was complex, half genius, half mystery, and maybe just a hint of something dark. On the table between them lay an elegant leather folder, and within it rested what Marco claimed was an original sketch by Sandro Botticelli himself, one of the most revered artists of the Renaissance. Edward had seen hundreds of fakes in his lifetime, but the moment the folder was opened, something about the delicate lines and faded parchment caught his breath. The figure sketched in soft strokes looked almost alive. A woman draped in flowing robes, her eyes hauntingly human. The parchment smelled faintly of old ink and smoke, as if it had been touched by time itself. Marco's voice, smooth as silk, carried confidence as he explained its history. How it had been discovered in a forgotten Florentine estate, verified by local experts, and acquired through private sale. Acquired. Edward listened, eyes narrowing slightly, his hand tracing the edge of the paper without touching it directly. As he leaned closer, the golden light caught the faintest shimmer in the ink, and for a fleeting second, he thought he could see the centuries hidden within it. The room felt smaller, quieter, as though everyone else had faded into the background. He was moments away from closing the deal, his pen already beside the contract. It was then that a soft voice interrupted the air, slicing through the elegant rhythm of the evening. "Excuse me, sir," said a young waitress, approaching with a tray of espresso cups balanced carefully in her hands. She was slender, dressed in the restaurant's black uniform, her dark hair tied neatly behind her head. Her name tag read Lucia. She moved with quiet confidence, the way only someone who had learned to observe more than they spoke could move. Edward barely glanced at her at first, until he noticed her eyes lingering on the parchment. Lucia paused for just a moment too long, her gaze fixed not on the billionaire nor the dealer, but on the sketch itself. Her brows furrowed ever so slightly, a tiny wrinkle forming between them, as if she had just seen something deeply wrong. Edward noticed. Marco did too. She set the espresso down with trembling fingers, and before either man could ask, she leaned closer, for her words to reach Edward's ear. In a tone so soft it was almost a secret, she whispered in perfect Italian, "Questo non nigra vrio, Rio, Ico." Then, as if to make sure he understood, she added in English, "This isn't a real one." For a moment, everything froze. The music seemed to stop, the air grew thick, and even the candlelight appeared to flicker lower. Edward looked up sharply, confusion flashing across his face. Marco's smile faltered, replaced by a quick defensive laugh. "What did she say?" he asked lightly, though his eyes betrayed something else, an unease creeping beneath his polished charm. Edward didn't answer. Instead, he studied Lucia carefully, sensing a quiet certainty in her tone that no amount of money could fabricate. The waitress took a hesitant step back, realizing the weight of what she had just said. Her pulse quickened, her face flushed, but her gaze didn't waver. It was as though instinct had forced her to speak, as though silence would have been a betrayal of something sacred inside her. Marco's voice tried to fill the silence again, smooth and dismissive. "She must be mistaken. It's easy to be confused when you don't understand art history," he said, his accent thickening as he forced a chuckle. But Edward had already seen enough liars in his lifetime to recognize the tremor behind that laughter. He turned to Lucia once more, lowering his tone. "What do you mean it's not real?" he asked. Her lips parted, but she hesitated. glancing toward her manager across the room, who was already glaring at her for engaging with a guest beyond her duty. Still, she found the courage to speak. "The ink," she said quietly. "It shines under this kind of light." Botticelli's ink never reflected gold. It absorbed it, and the paper's too smooth. It's been treated recently to look aged. I've seen this before in restoration training. Her voice trembled slightly, but her conviction was solid. Edward sat back slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing on the sketch. A faint tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. He didn't sign the contract. Marco's smile vanished entirely now, replaced by a rigid mask. Somewhere in the background, the violin resumed, but the melody no longer felt sweet. It felt heavy, charged. Lucia, the waitress who was never meant to be part of this evening, had just spoken the truth that could cost a man millions or save him from ruin. And in that moment, Edward realized something that money could never teach him. Sometimes the most valuable eyes in the room are not the ones trained to see profit, but the ones brave enough to see the truth. Edward's hand froze in midair, his pen hovering inches above the paper. The room seemed to lose its sound for a moment. The clinking of cutlery, the soft hum of conversation, even the faint music faded into the background as his gaze met Lucia's. The flicker of candlelight caught the reflection in her eyes, and he saw not arrogance, not hesitation, but pure conviction. The art dealer Marco Bellini shifted in his seat, his charming composure cracking slightly as his jaw tightened. "Excuse me." Edward's voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, the kind that made people think twice before lying. Lucia's throat tightened. She hadn't meant to speak. Not in front of a man like Edward Thorne, not in a restaurant like this, but she also couldn't take it back. "I said," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't real." Her accent was melodic, her Italian roots clear even when she spoke English. Marco forced a laugh, pretending to find amusement in the situation. "Ah, signor, you can't take advice from a waitress," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. She probably saw a copy in a museum gift shop once and thinks she's an expert. But Edward's expression didn't soften. Instead, he motioned for Lucia to continue. "You said the ink was wrong," he said quietly. Tell me why." Her eyes darted nervously around the room, to her manager who was staring in horror, and back to Edward. Sir," she began, "I studied art restoration before I started working here. I couldn't afford to finish my degree, but I've spent years around genuine Renaissance pieces. The ink on this one, it's too fresh. It bleeds differently on parchment when aged properly. This one, it looks like it was made to look old. Someone tried to heat it or stain it to mimic centuries of wear, but the color tone is slightly off." She paused, waiting for him to laugh or dismiss her. But Edward didn't. He leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. The art dealer's smile was now a thin, nervous line. In this, Marco interjected sharply, "You are overstepping. This is a delicate business transaction, not some classroom for amateur theories." Lucia didn't retreat. "But with respect, sir," she replied softly but firmly, "and no real Botticelli sketch would use that kind of ink. It reflects the light. The real formula absorbed it. It had more natural minerals." Marco tried again to cut her off, but Edward raised a hand. "Enough," he said. The tone was quiet, but it carried the weight of authority that froze them both. He turned to his assistant, a man standing discreetly nearby, and said, "Bring the ultraviolet scanner from the car." Marco's face paled. Mr. Thorne, surely there's no need to." "There is," Edward interrupted coldly. "If you're selling me a masterpiece worth 8 million euros, a few minutes of testing shouldn't concern you." His assistant hurried out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel her hands shaking, the adrenaline burning through her nerves. Nerves! She wondered if she had just ruined her job, or worse, humiliated a billionaire in front of his peers. Edward, however, remained calm, his gaze steady on the parchment before him. "Tell me," he said quietly to Lucia, "what made you so sure?" Her voice softened. "Because I've seen real ones, sir. I was lucky enough to intern at a museum in Florence for 3 months before my scholarship ended. I used to handle sketches like these with gloves and a magnifier. The texture of old paper, it changes with time. It cracks, curls slightly at the edge. This one looks artificially brittle, like it's been forced to age fast. It's wrong?" She hesitated, then added in a trembling whisper, And the pigment used for the shadowing, it's synthetic. It didn't exist in Botticelli's. The way she spoke was not rehearsed or proud. It was sincere, almost mournful, as if she hated seeing beauty corrupted by deception. When the assistant returned, he placed the compact UV device on the table. The lights dimmed slightly as Edward leaned over the sketch and turned it on. Under the violet glow, the truth revealed itself in seconds. The ink shimmered unnaturally, glowing faintly, an instant giveaway that modern chemicals had been used. Lucia was right. Edward's expression hardened. He didn't say a word. Marco tried one last time, stammering excuses. It must be the lighting. Perhaps the piece was retouched by an older collector, but Edward slammed the folder shut, his patience gone. You tried to sell me a forgery, he said quietly, his voice like ice. And you did it here in public? Marco's charm vanished entirely. Damn. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he muttered something in Italian under his breath. But it was too late. Edward gestured to the restaurant's security team, two discreet men stationed near the entrance, who immediately moved forward. Escort him out, Edward ordered. The dealer protested, cursing and shouting about misunderstandings, but no one listened. Guests turned to watch as he was led out, his voice echoing with desperation. Within moments, silence returned, broken only by the faint music of the violinist, who awkwardly resumed playing. Lucia stood frozen, her tray still trembling in her hands. She expected anger, maybe even dismissal, but instead, Edward looked at her with quiet admiration. You have a good eye, he said finally, setting down the scanner. Most experts wouldn't have caught that detail so quickly. She lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to interrupt, sir. I just couldn't stay quiet. Edward nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. There was something about her honesty that cut through the layers of formality and distance that usually surrounded him. In her voice, he heard the kind of truth that was becoming rare in his world, a world where people wore lies like perfume. After a long pause, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it gently across the table toward her. I run a private foundation in Florence, he said. We fund art research, restoration projects, and training for new talent. You have an eye most professionals spend decades trying to develop. I'd like you to join us. Lucia stared at the card, unsure if it was real. Sir, I can't, she stammered. I don't even have a degree yet. He raised a hand to stop her. You don't need a degree to have talent. You proved your worth tonight in front of a man who's been collecting art for 30 years. You saw what I didn't. That's enough for me. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She felt tears sting her eyes, a mix of disbelief and gratitude overwhelming her. All those long nights spent cleaning tables, sketching on napkins during her breaks, dreaming of the life she left behind. It all seemed to come together in that single moment. A thank you, she whispered finally, her voice trembling. A grazie, signor? Edward smiled, and for the first time that evening, the cold, calculating collector was gone. In his place sat a man who remembered what it meant to feel inspired. You deserve it, he said simply. The people like you remind me why I fell in love with art in the first place. Not because of the price tags, but because of the truth it carries. They spoke for a while longer, not about business or deals, but about Florence, about art, about how every masterpiece carries the soul of the person who created it. Lucia told him how she used to visit the Uffizi Gallery as a child, how she'd stand for hours in front of Botticelli's of The Birth of Venus, mesmerized by its colors, its grace. Edward listened quietly, realizing that somewhere along his journey of collecting art he had forgotten to feel it. The night grew quieter still, the restaurant nearly empty now. When Lucia finally stood to leave, Edward said, I'll be ready in a week. My office will arrange your travel. You have a place in Florence now. As she walked home beneath the starlit Italian sky, Lucia felt as though the city itself had changed. The cobblestones glimmered under the soft streetlights, and a cool breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine through the narrow alleys. Her heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't fear. It was hope. She looked up at the sky and smiled, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude. In a world that often rewarded deceit, she had spoken the truth, and the truth had opened a door she never thought she'd see again. Somewhere across the city, Edward sat in his car, gazing out the window at the sleeping streets of Rome, thinking of the waitress who had saved him. For once, he wasn't thinking about profits or possessions, but about something far greater, the priceless value of honesty and the beauty of a soul unafraid to speak